We can have the
I
record.
just sent it to you this morning. It's from Charlie Munford. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, Kathleen.
Yes, good morning, Dr. Kauffmann. Oh, yes.
You're online. Hold on.
Fantastic.
Oh, so who's the researcher that does the CBC theory? I don't remember his name off the top of my head.
The names on the paper are Baluska and Reber.
Okay. So is Dr. Baluska going to be on this morning too?
He answered that he would not be available for this meeting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe one thing we can do is, I mean, I don't know if we have some topics to talk about, but maybe have Dr. Reber introduce the work. That was a pretty interesting paper. Actually,
Barry, hi.
Hi, Barry.
Hi. Good to see you guys.
Charlie, I can also speak with Aurther Reber about the CBC theory, because we co-author together, and so can Pedrag. So we got a full crew here, nonetheless.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. Do you guys want to do really quick introductions? Since we've got some new faces, we can go really quickly around the circle and just say who we are. And so I'm Charlie Munford. I'm the founder of an organization called Talking Octopus that is dedicated to building a physical model of agential biological systems. So, Wayne, would you like to?
Sure. I'm Wayne Lewis. I'm kind of an independent thinker and researcher. Really across these waters. My background's in biology, physics, and mathematics, but pretty big into cognitive science, complexity, and pretty much any question of life and mind.
Wonderful.
Wayne, this is Stu.
Hey, Stu.
I don't see you. If others can.
Let me turn the camera. Maybe I may have the camera turned off. Hold on a second. Yeah, I do. All right. There we go. Can you see me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I did get that paper that I asked you about anyway. I was able to get it from, I just asked Perplexity, gave me a link.
So I'm Stu Kauffmann, and interested in origin of life and cognition and mind and stuff. And I'm glad to be joining you. What a fascinating bunch of confused conversations. It's perfect. Confusion is important.
That's the goal. Absolutely. Dr. Miller?
Yes, I was a physician in academic and private practice for 35 years, and went to a meeting in Chicago, decided to play hooky late one afternoon, getting tired of the medical meeting, went to the Natural History Museum and saw Sue the Tyrannosaurus Rex. And from that trigger, which opened a whole range of new questions for me to ponder, I switched from medicine to evolutionary biology and have been writing actively and continuously with many colleagues since 2013. And all of my work concentrates on the intelligent measuring cell, the role of cognition in evolution. And I have founded the first complete comprehensive alternative to neo-Darwinism, which is cognition-based evolution. I'm close partners with Aurther and Pedrag. I guess I would say we're partners in crime in delineating a narrative of cognition in biology.
Wonderful. Dr. Reber?
Who's next?
You are.
You are Dr. Reber?
Yes, sure. We pronounce it Reber, by the way.
Reber, sorry about that.
Yeah. I don't know why, but that's the way we've always done it. I'm a cognitive psychologist, and I find myself in an odd position here. In my middle 80s, I'm publishing widely in biology journals, and I never took a course in biology in my life. I got into this racket back in the 1990s when I began musing on the origins of consciousness and cognition and awareness. And it seemed to me that everyone was getting it wrong. And they were getting it wrong for the obvious reason that they started with themselves. They started with Homo sapiens, because there's no doubt, I'm conscious. I know I have consciousness. You look like me, so I'll be generous. I'll give it to you too. And now we'll begin the explorations by moving backwards through the evolutionary tree and see where it runs out. And amusingly, if you look at this literature, you discover that it runs out with the species that the particular biologist or evolutionary biologist is studying. So if they study insects, that's where it starts. They study cephalopods, that's where it starts. No one wants to push it back. They don't want to push it to its origins. But what hit me, and I first gave a paper on this in the 1990s, the British Psychological Society. It was a conversation with a caterpillar. And it seemed pretty clear that we had to go back to the very beginnings. And so I came up with the CBC, the cellular basis of consciousness theory. And just a little tidbit, and then I'll turn it over to somebody else. When I was invited to give this keynote address at the British Psychological Society, I was really looking for a classic confrontation. To me, the more interesting elements, Pedrag probably gives some insights into this, is the British academic is a worthy opponent in any setting. And I was sure that I was going to get a lot of blowback on my presentation, and nothing happened. They got up, they applauded quietly and walked out. And I turned to the moderator and I said, "What happened?" And she said, "Oh, well, last year there was a kind of a testy talk, and the accusations and attacks from the audience were so fierce and so disruptive that it really upset the speaker. And we decided that if there was going to be a controversial topic, that there would be no question period. So I never got I guess I never got the arguments that I really wanted. But we're getting them now. And it's interesting to watch the reactions amongst the standard bearers in evolutionary biology. One last line, and then I'm done. Nobody seems to be disturbed by the fact that all species evolved from unicellular prokaryotes 4 billion years ago. And all we're really saying is that cognition did the same thing. Okay, I'll turn it over to somebody else. Oh, Pedrag?
Right.
How do you pronounce your last name? And don't you dare say it's just like it's spelled.
Well, hi everyone, and my name is Pedrag Slijepcevik. So Slijepcevik, it's quite difficult, but that's what it is.
Thank you.
Okay, so Aurther and Bill, thanks for introducing me. Actually, most of my professional life I spent working as a geneticist in the lab, but the last about 5-10 years I've been thinking about things that Aurther and Bill mentioned. And last year I published a book called Biocivilizations, in which I argued that all organisms are essentially cognitive agents, and that civilizational elements like language, medicine, science, art do exist in other non-human cultures. Bacteria do have, say, communication. Various animal species are engaged in the acts of art. Science as a problem solving is also, widely is widespread in nature, etc. So when this book was due to be published, I by chance communicated with František Baluska, who's not here, and he endorsed it, and he asked me to endorse the Sentient Cell, the book that's published last year by Aurther, Bill, and František, and we started collaboration. That was about a year ago, I guess. So we're now working together and published quite a lot of papers together, and hopefully we'll publish a book or work on a book soon. That's my introduction.
Wonderful. Catherine, would you like to?
Hi, it's really great to meet you all. My name is Catherine Peil Kauffmann. Well, I guess I have work in both names, but I started in clinical psychology, walking backwards to try to understand the emotional system, which my life experiences, both personal and professional, had shown me to be kind of the center of the best and the worst of human behavior, our emotional system. And at the time, and which is still pretty much the case, emotion is such a huge, wide, broad system that there are many, many, many people that have one little bit of it. It's kind of the elephant and the blind man's story. But there wasn't any unifying, functional, biological based interpretation for what emotion actually does for us. And it is a separate process than cognition. It's an earlier process. It's fully embodied. And yet even cognitive science still has it interwoven, which is a little bit of a problem still. But that, so I've been walking backwards from the mid-90s with the idea that emotion is actually a sensory system, the very first one to have emerged. And I put all this together in a paper in 2014 where I pointed to the sensory motor circuitry of the E. coli bacterium to show this little sort of cybernetic loop of mind. And for a long time, most people have no idea what I'm talking about. So it's wonderful to see so many people coming either from AI or, AI-inspired cognitive science to the very edges of these questions and these issues. And so I was really delighted to find František's work. I remember coming across the concept of the CNOME a while ago, which is you guys, I guess, right? And it's fabulous. I love what you're doing. And from those of us that still are frustrated by mechanical models that tell us as psychologists that the things that are the most important to us, like identity, and identity boundaries, developmental windows, developmental trajectories, all of these things, even information, we're throwing up our hands in revolt and we're saying, we're going to put sentience back in the middle of the story. We want subjectivity back in the middle of the story. So it's great that there's so many wonderful things coming from the bottom up, particularly this clock model, because my interpretation of the function of emotion is that it serves the function of self-regulation. And that's a huge, broad category that needs to be packed up, but it's essentially captured in autopoiesis. It's captured in self-organizing structures. It's captured in even just all the way down to the work of the agent that's required of a far from equilibrium living system. So the idea of the self, it opens the door to identity. And seems to be a misconception that the self requires language and high cognitive meta consciousness, and that's just not true. Self-identity is writ large all through genetics, epigenetics, the immune system. So the regulatory processes that I'm identifying that give us the coarse-grained experiences of physical and psychological pleasure and pain are all rooted in some of the most deepest organizing principles and regulatory activity of the body. So it's what's the most important to me is the fact that this leads to a value system in nature that science has never really looked at. And yet, when you understand what this function is, it kind of it gives us an inroad into where we've gone wrong in terms of thinking about good and bad and right and wrong and constructions of good and evil and us versus them. When the identity structure, when you follow it all the way down, is actually both a part and a whole. We are both autonomous agents and social entities. And any conflict between us is actually a conflict within the body with stress chemistry and everything associated with it. So I'm interested in the bigger applications in terms of a new spiritual story for who we are as human beings and where we can go with that in terms of personal therapeutic and understanding the spiritual dimensions of life and grounding it in biology. So there's lots more to say, but along the way, I met this Kauffmann dude, and we've been hanging out, and I've been, since I wrote that paper, really digging into the deeper science beneath the chemical level. Michael Levin's work is profound as far as I'm concerned, looking at, this is a higher level of, or a lower level of organization and bioelectric signaling that I think is absolutely essential to the suite of stimulus that gives rise to emotional sentience. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you. Perry?
Preach it, sister. Catherine, that was amazing.
I haven't
I'm
seen you
Perry.
since too fast. Hi.
It's been a long time. I saw you and Stu have an interview with Michael Levin a few months ago. It was great. So I'm Perry Marshall from Chicago. I'm kind of like Aurther. I've never taken a biology class, but I'm even worse than that because Aurther at least has credentials in psychology. I'm a marketer, so I practice psychology without a license. So I'm completely illegitimate.
You certainly do.
I'm a serial entrepreneur and an author. I'm also an engineer by education. And 20 years ago, I got extremely interested in evolutionary biology because none of the explanations of evolution made any sense to me as an engineer. And when I started discovering McClintock and Margulis and people like that, I was like, now this makes sense. And this is a level of engineering that any engineer would be envious of. And we should be studying this. And so 5 years ago, I got with Dennis Noble and we announced a $10 million prize for the origin of the genetic code. And what that really is, is the most, what we're looking for is the most fundamental in question in science that I know of that can be defined in a reductionist way. You can define what you're looking for in origin of information with a reductionist definition. But I believe that the answer is decidedly non-reductionist. The answer is cognition and consciousness, which is obviously what this group is all about. And so I've been digging for the bottom of the swamp, and I keep ending up here. I wrote a book called Evolution 2.0, Breaking the Deadlock Between Darwin and Design. And I also wrote a paper with Bill Miller, Aurther Reber, and František, came out about a year ago, called Natural Viral Engineering in Cognition-Based Evolution.
Don't leave out cells. Viral cellular.
Sorry.
Cellular engineering. No, it's a team.
And I'm also heavily involved in cancer research, and that's turned into a whole second career. And I don't believe any of these questions, how do viruses really operate? What is cancer? Cancer, like to Catherine's point, cancer is a disease of cellular identity.
Yep.
And it's a cell with has adopted a different identity, evolving out of control, and it's switching on all of its evolutionary machinery to defend itself. And if you don't understand,
it thinks it's an amoeba, so it's lost
yes,
the tissue.
It's a whole agent. It's lost its part of a greater whole, the second half of its identity.
yes. Yeah. And so if you say cancer is genetic disease or cancer is, all those definitions are going to take you in the wrong direction, and you're going to end up killing people with chemotherapy for 100 years and never accomplishing anything. And so with an identity-based definition of biology, then you can really start to get somewhere, and we are getting somewhere. And I could talk about that for an hour, but I won't, because that's not why we're here today. But I'm very happy to be here, and I know actually most of you. I'm delighted. I don't know Wayne. I don't know Pedrag. And Charlie is new to me as of a few weeks ago. So
just Perry, just to add to what you said about cancer, I'm interested as a researcher, as a laboratory researcher, in structures called telomeres.
Oh,
these are at the ends of chromosomes, and they basically, there is an enzyme called telomerase that seem to be involved in cancer. And investigating, cancer for maybe 20 years, I came across different models. So it's not only that cancer is due to cells losing their identity. The multicellular bodies sometimes have control over cells. So there are some cancer models. Organisms are resistant to cancer. And these are completely different from humans. So what happens sometime, say we humans get cancer, the cells start proliferating really out of control. Some of these model organisms actually have systems like enzymes that come and wipe out all cancer cells. And these are certain enzymes, and now people, especially in the US, I know a few researchers who are investigating whether they can use these, extract these from these organisms, these animals basically, and apply them then to human system. So it's actually, cancer is a two-way thing. It's not only cells losing their identity, but also the multicellular bodies, the corporate bodies being capable of controlling cells. So two-way causation, I would say. But I think in the case of sometimes the human cancer as a model is misleading. So we have to look wider in nature. And the question is why, say, in bacteria basically are sometimes behaving as multicellular organisms. And the question is why don't, bacterial colonies have that problem of some cells getting out of control in the system. So it's a very, very complex thing.
Right.
we only scratching the surface here.
So if I might mention, I trained as a doctor, and in 1985, Marc Balavé and I filed the first patent on the idea of creating literally billions of random DNA sequences to create billions of novel RNA and protein sequences that we call never-before-born genes that are part of the biosphere, and screening those for useful molecules. That's now all over the world. The field is worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and I'm not, which is a good thing. Anyway, so that has led me, I think you know this, Perry, it's a couple of years, about 4 years ago, I have formed a company with others called P4 Bios with Lee Hood, and some other people in Sweden. The basic idea is to generate novel peptides and find novel peptides. Cell types are attractors of genetic regulatory networks. And the idea is, can we find perturbations that take a cancer cell and trigger it into differentiating into a normal cell? That's known to be possible. And in fact, I've done it with Sui Huang. It's sort of cancer differentiation therapy. It's not well explored, but it's got a reasonable chance. So it's such a huge field. And I join you in thinking there are new hopes.
So I've been thinking about cancer in these kind of terms, especially in terms of like identity and agency, for 30 years. My first thoughts about this were when I was an undergrad and I took a senior course in cancer biology. So we're talking about this kind of two different stories here. We're talking about the circuitry story that's going on with telomeres and the mutations. And we're also talking about, the agency and identity question and sort of loss of connectivity and identity as part of larger wholes. One thing I would point out is that Mike Levin has some empirical work that actually demonstrates you can have cells that are blazingly expressing oncogenes. This is both glioblastoma and some RAS mutants. But as long as you can restore their electrical connectivity to the rest of the tissue that they're involved in, they don't become cancer. So it's kind of the point is the molecular point of view might not really be the way to attack it. I mean, I think we're all kind of seeing this. What we're really looking to do maybe is get the cells to understand that they're part of larger wholes and not to be disconnected from the rest of the tissue that they're in. What you were doing with the peptides, Stu, this can kind of work the same way as what Mike does with bioelectricity, is that we're sort of doing identity hacking with these peptides and hormones at larger scale. So sensible.
Can I jump in and ask a naive question? Because I don't know anything about the underlying biology here. But if we're going to conceptualize cancer as a breakdown in the identity of a cell, why is there metastasized cancers?
Well, that's kind of the whole thing, is when a cell, number one, of course, it has some of its original identity as sort of a single autonomous agent, but it also, through things like bioelectricity and other mechanisms, has an identity as part of a larger whole. So you have these connectivity channels through the cells where they can tell what's going on in their neighbors. They also can sense the bioelectric membrane potentials. So as long as the reason that they start to metastasize is they no longer recognize the higher order identity as being part of a tissue, and now they've sort of they just go back to their local identity as an autonomous agent. So essentially, I'm an amoeba, and the rest of the body that used to be I was sort of incorporated into by various mechanisms, I now just see as environment.
Yep.
I'd like to offer, if I may, an alternative point of view.
Okay.
I think that the critical reduction in dealing with cancer has been identified, which is cancer is an alternative self for reasons that we don't know. But all cancers have alternative karyotypes. So that may have something to do with it. Genes have something important to do with it, but surely not all, because there are many cells with alternate karyotypes that are not cancerous. Metastasis occurs almost ubiquitously in cancer. For example, in breast cancer, on discovery, this was metastatic disease. And it took a very, very long time for us to understand that as clinicians. It was treated always as a local phenomenon. You would excise the local tumor. But what's missing is cancer is an alternate self, for reasons that we don't know, which triggers alternate viral cellular engineering. It is an actually alternate engineering process of cells that are competing, collaborating, cooperating, codependencies, but slightly different. They're steel resources. They are exploiting an alternate niche construction. And it's all niche construction. Why do we have metastases? Because we, as multicellular organisms, use we are really meant to explore the environment for cells. I know this seems like a little odd thing to say, but our phenotypes enable us to explore the environment, and we return all this information back to our cells. Yep. And our cells undergo continuous adaptation. And that's why cells have continuously survived for 4 billion years. We are vehicles for that continuous adaptation of the 3 cellular domains and their companion environment. Cancer metastases are ubiquitous because they send out cells to explore the environment for suitable alternate areas of niche construction.
Yeah, it's really basically the same argument. So kind of the point is that ordinarily the cells, they're highly constrained through higher order constraints in which they're engaged in, right? So you have a cell that's part of a tissue. There's a bunch of different mechanisms, and we don't even maybe know all of them, by which they're constrained, but bioelectricity is one that's been empirically studied a lot, that constrain what the cell is actually able to do, right? And one of the first things that happens in cancer, and this is almost across the board, is loss of electrical connectivity through gap junctions and such to nearby neighbor cells.
Sure, I absolutely agree with that. The bioelectricity is certainly singularly important because that's cell-cell communication. If you want to obstruct an engineering process, the most efficient way to go about that is to obstruct the communication pattern of the engineers. And I know I'm putting it on very anthropomorphic terms. It seems somewhat simplistic, but it really is a better understanding of the process than going about it the way we have traditionally.
Well, Bill, why are different cancers have different virulence? Some are relatively benign. Squamous cell cancers are readily, easily taken care of. But if it gets to your liver or your spine, you're in trouble.
Yeah, I don't have that answer.
But if there's again, I'm coming this from a naive point of view, because I'm not aware of the delicate elements that are involved in cellular changes here. But the picture that I'm seeing, it doesn't feel clear to me. Is my puzzlement?
Yeah, I don't have an answer.
Can I be puzzled?
Sure. I think you're asking a terrific question. I don't have the answer. I will say that there are ways to look at it within the concept of co-engineering that I'm sure Perry would agree with. For example, the answer might be that there's a totally different population of phages in virulent cancers compared. Every cell has phages. Every bacterial cell has phages. And many of our own cells have phages, and we don't even begin to understand those. The answer could be something like that, which affects the ability to trade resources, the willingness to be companionate, cooperative, social in a normal way versus the rogue state that cancer represents.
All right, well, look, maybe this identity notion, this cognition component is secondary, not primary. And there's something goes wrong, say, with the cellular membrane. And that produces this disruption in the underlying, say, the psychology of the cell.
One thing I might say is that, so if you understand the way organisms are integrated, if I use like Stu's terminology as Kantian whole, or or from autopoiesis, or from Rosen, or for some things that come after that, so one way of looking at it that's kind of useful is so you have constraints at one level, and these constraints actually mutually support each other, and you can get a closure where collectively, sort of like the autocatalytic closure, where the constraints collectively give rise to a higher order constraint. And you have this process going on over many different levels. So when we're talking about wholes and identity, we really are talking about something, I hate to use philosophical words, but we're talking about something ontological, not epistemological, something that actually exists in the universe. And the issue a lot of times is what scale do we want to interact with an agent at, right? So if we interact at the level of the lower level constraints, but what's most causally efficacious in the particular phenomenon we're looking for is occurring at the higher order, you really have very little chance of getting anywhere. That's how I see it.
Can
And,
I build on that a little bit?
Yeah.
Can I build on that? I'm glad you introduced the idea of a Kantian whole, because I think that is the fundamental concept where a lot of these strands are going to come together in finding that sort of essential organization, because this is what I call the dance between parts and wholes. And you do have something going on that's very universal at every level of scale. And that's why you see the nested holons so ultimately there's going to be a network story at each level. But what I think is key to this question is we're talking about both bottom-up and top-down regulatory processes that sort of give it's called operational closure, it's called organizational closure, it's called catalytic closure, it's called constraint closure. It's a kind of closure that's also, I believe, an information control closure, and that there is a systematic way that the parts are doing what they're doing that give rise to the whole, and then the whole feeds back down those constraints. But that organization, that dynamism is happening all the time. So when we talk about bottom up and top down, what we're really talking about is a boundary between any given structure, whether it's a part, and that structure is interacting with a local environment. So you need to consider what we mean by boundaries. How are those boundaries constructed? And then, of course, in autopoietic systems, they're constructing their own boundaries. And the interface between the internal world and the external world is the cell membrane at first, with all of these signaling processes that we're finding out about. So to me, the whole top-down, bottom-up business is better thought of as a horizontal, even though those are nested holes are true, but that you have self-regulatory activity at every level of scale, where you're interacting with whatever the external environment is. But and that's beautiful, but you need some common language across all levels in the simple rules that give rise to higher organization. And that, to me, is where you get to the nub of what emotional valence actually is, where it comes from and how we experience it. And to me, there's an edge of chaos story in all of this, where at the network, the system has a preference for the node being in a particular home state, if you will, on the edge of chaos. It knows that it's, and it might even be a natural harmonic, which I'm hoping Richard Lewis can join us.
Richard Watson couldn't make it this week, unfortunately. But
yeah. And so that's how you align to your own autonomous agency. But that, since all identity is actually both a part and a whole, the way that you align with the higher level whole is through resonance. And that so you have two modes. You have, this is my home state, and I prefer connecting with others who are on that home state, whoever I can perceive that in others. That, to me, is kind of where we're going with this. But that in the paper that I did in 2014, I used the language of feedback dynamics, because the parts were doing something that was amplifying signals, and that the whole interacting with its environment is also using those signals from the internal to mediate its interactions with affordances in the external environment. And those actions and feedback down to constrain. So I had both a positive and a negative feedback arrangement where you get the homeostasis from the top down, and you get an amplification of this coarse graining all the way up. And so that amplification we experience as positive and negative valence. It's embodied, and it's binary because it's giving a value system that we use to identify affordances, good for me or bad for me in the world. And that's why the Frisson story, free energy principle is great, but it's missing the valence piece.
Two quick notes. Number one, this is a very nice segue.
Wayne, could I interrupt for a second? Because there's a really interesting theme that we just kind of uncovered, and I think we talked about this last time also, the idea of a Kantian whole. And I have a really interesting, I think Kantian wholes are a very interesting mistake. So I have like a totally different view of this, because my understanding of a Kantian whole is that it's a system that exists for the sake of itself, right? It's its own final cause. And so sort of self-interest is the ruling ethos. It's the telos of the system. But if you think about that, to me, there's a paradox, because self-interest really doesn't scale. And when we're talking about cancer, we're talking about a very acute occasion of self-interest not scaling, right? Because the self-interest of this cancer is incompatible with my own self-interest. Or
you're missing the nestedness
cellular body, right? So then we have to do a lot of gymnastics to see, like, is it upwards, downwards causation? Like, how do these two things harmonize? And so my way of breaking apart that Gordian knot is maybe unconventional, but it seems to me that there's a really simple but overlooked thought experiment that we could do. So I think about two cells that are on the border of two different tissues, and just during normal differentiation, like, let's say, the iris and the pupil in the eyeball. So those two cells right next to each other, one decides to become a pupil cell and the other one decides to become an iris. You could take any tissue you want, and you can see, during development, all these decisions are made, right? Well, during the course of a multicellular organism's life, it cannot receive any signal from natural selection, right? So whatever signal it only got one time in the inheritance that was present in the very first cell, the zygote. And so whatever makes the difference between those two cells, it can't have anything to do with natural selection. There's just that's logically impossible. So that means that there is some language that's not about survival and reproduction that's being spoken between different cells from cell to cell. So like what Catherine's saying about a sort of universal language. And so not just between cell and cell, but between cell and the world, right? Between the cell and the Umwelt, and the outside of the self. Because obviously in the case of cancer, they're treating the rest of the body as an external environment. So that's the way I think about it. And the consequence of that idea would be that life is really not trying to survive and reproduce, that happened by accident. and it happens by accident every time. Obviously we inherit something. I mean, there's something that's heritable, but we kind of already know what that is, right? It's a set of tools. It's a very, very complicated, super long, error-corrected set of tools that are created as a sort of memory. And obviously it has some impact on how we develop using this language that we're using, that's universal. But the way it impacts our language is it's sort of like the idea that, there's certain phrases that are inexpressible in English, but you can express them in like Tagalog or Spanish or whatever. That there's certain situations you find yourself in as a cell that your tools are not they're gonna bias your choice making in a certain direction, right? So if you're on the border of those two tissues, the tools that you have in your toolkit are gonna help you make that decision because that's their nature.
Charlie,
Hey, wait, excuse me. Give me a minute to talk about Kantian wholes, if I may. And maybe a little bit slowly. So this is Kant, 1790, Critique of Judgment. I think he had one of the fundamental ideas. The physicists don't have it yet. It's really interesting. So Kant said, in organized beings, he's thinking of living things, have the property that the parts exist for and by means of the whole. So pause. We're all Kantian wholes. I exist because I've got livers and kidneys and a spleen, and they exist because they're part of me. I am a Kantian whole. I'm going to give you a very simple example. I worked on the organ for about 50 years. Gonan Ashkenazi in the bacteria has a 9-peptide collectively autocatalytic set. So this works. Here's what happens. Peptide 1, so it's a non-equilibrium chemical reaction system. There are 9 peptides that mutually catalyze one another's formation, and the building blocks are fed in from the outside. The building blocks are half fragments of each peptide. So the left and the right half of each peptide is shoved in from the outside. So peptide 1 binds the 2 half fragments of peptide 2 and binds them together or ligates them to make a second copy of peptide 2. Peptide 2 binds the 2 half fragments of peptide 3 and ligates them to make a second copy of peptide 3 around a cycle. And it actually works. It's a chemical reaction and it's producing. So two of the properties there's obviously a Kantian whole. Each peptide is a part, and it gets to exist because it's part of the Kantian whole. What reproduces is the whole, the Kantian whole, and the parts get to exist because they're part of the whole, but the whole gets to exist because it's made of the parts. This is a very important concept, and it's not in physics, although it could be. So not everything is a Kantian whole. For example, a crystal is not a Kantian whole. I think a quartz crystal, it's a crystal, but the atoms of quartz don't have to be part of the crystal to exist as those atoms. The sand pile isn't a Kantian whole. The grains can exist whether or not they're part of the sand pile. Most things are not Kantian wholes. We are. Concept 1 is Kantian whole. Concept 2 is catalytic closure. So every peptide in Gonan set has its formation catalyzed by at least one other peptide in the set. No peptide catalyzes its own formation. The third concept is really stunning. I had a little bit to do with this invention. Let me set up the puzzle. So this is so neat. Just let's pause over it. It's this notion of constraint closure. I got halfway there in the year 2000. I got totally lost. Mael Monteville and Matteo Mosio in 2015 solved it. It's just beautiful. So I was trying to understand what's the work cycle, and the work cycle, the theta engine. So I was thinking about what's work. Well, ask a physicist. Work is force acting through a distance. There's a book by Atkins about the second law, and he says, no, work's much more interesting. His phrase, work is the constrained release of energy into a few degrees of freedom. This is going to relate to Terry Deacon's work. We came at it kind of independently. Well, what in the world does that phrase mean? So think of a cannon and the powder and the cannonball, and the powder explodes. And because the cannon is there, it's the constraint on the release of energy. You don't get a spherical explosion because the cannon is there as a constraint and a boundary condition. The explosion is a non-spherical wave that blasts the cannonball down the bore of the cannon. Well, I can understand that. Okay, so, but I'm a doctor, so I didn't ask the physicist question. I said, okay, you got to have constraints on the release of energy to get work. Where'd the cannon come from? so what the physicists do is they put in their boundary conditions from the outside. Newton says he's got the laws, the initial, you know, and then he's got the boundary conditions, but Newton doesn't tell you where the boundary conditions are coming from. So I reasoned, I said, it took work to make the cannon, right? People had to assemble a cannon. And I got as far as, no constraints, no work. Where did the cannon come from? There were none at the Big Bang. I was there. So I got stuck with that, except I could get one step further. Work done could construct something that could be a constraint. And I got totally lost. So pause over this. We're going to get to Alain Vital. It's quite astonishing. So Matteo Mosio and Mael Monteville found an answer. It's just so beautiful. The idea is constraint closure. So they wanted to get some work, so they need some non-equilibrium processes. That there be 3 non-equilibrium processes, 1, 2, and 3. But to get some work, you need some constraints. So let there be 3 constraints, A, B, and C. Okay. A constrains the release of energy in process 1 that constructs a B. B constrains the release of energy in process 2, and it constructs a C. C constrains the release of energy in process 3, and it constructs an A. This is constraint closure. Let's pause and really let it sink in. A, B, and C are constraints. They're boundary conditions. In a constraint closed system, the constraints or boundary condition literally constrain the release of energy in some processes that constructs the very same boundary conditions. Isn't that amazing? So think about us. We construct our automobiles, right? And they constrain the release of energy all over the place. So the gas explodes and the pistons go around and the wheels go round and around. An automobile doesn't construct itself. Cells do. So let me then finish it up with Gonin-Ashkenazi autocatalytic peptide set. Each peptide is a catalyst that's binding the 2 half fragments of the next peptide. So peptide 1 is a boundary condition enzyme that binds the 2 half fragments of peptide 2, so it constrains their motion in 3 space. So it lowers the activation barrier for the reaction that ligates the 2 half fragments of peptide 2, and then thermodynamic work is done to construct the peptide bond. So work is done by peptide 1, the constrained release of energy, to construct the second copy of peptide 2, so on around the cycle. So Gonin-Ashkenazi system is a Kantian whole. It has constraint closure, catalytic, but constraint closure. So just feel it. I'll say it again. It takes a while to let it sink in. A constraint closed system has the property that there's a set of constraints, A, B, and C, that are boundary conditions, and they constrain the release of energy to construct themselves, the very same boundary conditions. Living cells do that.
But it has no creativity.
Charlie.
No, hang on. Charlie, just a second. It makes itself, okay? It's not yet evolving, Charlie. It is, so we now know. So Gonin's system is autocatalytic, constraint closed. And if it makes a lipid boundary, for example, like a liposome, it becomes a protocell. To be creative, it has to evolve. And we then have to ask, is that evolutionary process algorithmic? And no algorithmic system has ever achieved open-ended evolution. And the way open-ended evolution happens is where you're probing so hard in your conversations, and we all are, it's not algorithmic. And that's because, and Robert Rosen was there, you cannot finitely describe all the possibilities. So evolving life keeps making new possibilities. And the basic reason is the function of a part is that subset of its causal properties that supports the whole. So the function of your heart is to pump blood, not make heart sounds. But the same part can be used to do different things, and you can't deduce the different uses of things. And that's where the creativity comes in. Before find, I think. Done.
Okay, so
I think of it as like, I think of that as sort of upside down, though. I think of the constraints as the inherited constraints. So, like the inherited DNA, right? The nucleotides that constrain which protein. Someone should be on mute. That's not on mute. I'm not sure who that is, but
it was me. I had to go inside there, guys. But, so a couple quick things, Charlie. I'd like to have a conversation with you because I think there's some things I could really clarify for you that. But we have a nice. Well, so before I do the other two things,
may I
we
first
have
ask you a question though? Because I just want to know. I just want to drill down to. So if the two cells that are making different decisions, if they can't use natural selection in their decision-making process because they don't have any access to natural selection, right? They receive the same inheritance. Then how can they be existing for the sake of the perpetuation of the whole? I feel like that's a logical problem.
Well, first of all, you're placing perhaps way too much importance on genetics. You're not realizing that the genes are sort of a toolbox for the bigger whole. But
no, that's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Everyone here does would agree with that. I'm pretty sure. So one thing is we do want to talk about CBC theory a little bit, and the whole idea of these different nested holes and processes and these emergent constraints. And I want to clarify a couple things about this. Is a nice segue, because one thing that's really important to realize is that these different scales of organization also work at different time scales, which is going to be a great, the coarse graining is over different time scales. So this is going to be a great segue to the CBC theory, and we definitely want to hear about that. I want to clarify a couple concepts because there may be confusion. We're throwing around closure, for instance. So as a mathematician, what closure means, and are there folks here that don't really follow exactly what we mean when we say closure? If I can just ask a general question.
It would help me if you would define it.
Yeah, so what we're talking about, so if I were to go to say, I don't know who's familiar with abstract algebra, just imagine you have a set of things, all right? And each of these things go through, there's a binary operation where I say this thing, operation, this thing gives me something. It gives me a product, okay? Now, when we say closure, we have a set of these things with a binary operation such that every time you take two of these things and do a binary operation, it's still going to be part of the same collection. That's what we mean by closure. Does that make sense or not really?
Isn't that the same thing as that's a group, right? It's a finite group.
Yeah, that's where it's an abstract algebra concept, but it's really the same concept everywhere. When we say closure, that's what we really mean. And I think we throw the word around, and there may be folks here that don't really understand what we mean by it. And I certainly don't want people to be completely confused about what we're saying.
I see how that's an intellectual structure that gets you to
a
form of self-replicating life.
Yeah, that's going on there too. Now the other word we're throwing around constraints, meta constraints, and you had a kind of thing with will to survive, right? So when we look at a group of constraints that have a closure property, and that closure property, and this goes to specifically kind of to Deacon's work, and that closure property is self-perpetuating for the entire set. This is where you have a higher order constraint, and that higher order constraint is perpetuation, right? That's what we mean by, by survival. It's this higher order constraint that dictates perpetuation, and that's because the internal constraints mutually support each other's construction, right? So now we have a higher order.
Then all those constraints have to be inherited.
No, some of them are inherited, some of them are constructed in real time. And even if they are inherited, the inheritance doesn't necessarily need to be through the genome. The inheritance can be epigenetic in a zillion different ways. It can have to do with niche, with developmental niche construction. So organisms over time are all actually manipulate the niche in which the next generation develops, right? You also have.
We're all interested in answering the question how those alternate systems of inheritance can be functional.
Well, and we don't know all of them for sure. Well, some of them are very consistent.
Like,
right?
why don't they derange the evolved structure of the organism?
Well, that's kind of a long discussion. I mean, we can have some of this discussion, and we certainly don't know all the answers. But we do have.
I think the answer is, I think that's the reason why this CBC clock theory is so interesting. And I think many of us share the intuition that there's a mechanism that's missing from biology.
There's a bunch of them.
So these guys are exploring that mechanism as circadian clocks, which
right.
That to me serves as at least a partial solution. Like it sort of opens up the possibility that interlocking networks of oscillators are what is creating that language of communication between cells and whole organisms. I mean, that's why the theory makes sense. That's why the theory makes sense to me, but it seems to me incompatible with the idea of Kantian holes.
No, it's not at all.
Why? Just a second. Wait, why?
Can I jump in really quick here? Because Stu and I are on a little island and our arborist just arrived at the dock. He's going to be taking care of some trees. And I'm going to have to go out and work with him. But I just wanted to say, Charlie, one of the points that I want to make is that we do have access to natural selection signals because organisms have been interacting with the environment as part of the story of evolution. Evolution has been happening in real time ever since the beginning. And the coarse graining that I'm talking about that we experience as pleasure and pain is exactly the criteria for natural selection, because it's not just about self-preservation. Negative emotions are mediating the function of preservation of form and stability, keeping the structure that we need. But the positive emotions are associated with the creativity and the emergence of new wholes and the cooperation and the broadening of the boundary into new wholes, which serves the alternative self-regulatory purpose of self-development. You have both of these going on all the time. And our negative emotions are saying no to anything that's destructive to the stable structure. And our positive emotions are calling us toward new opportunities and new growth and new ways of doing things. So I just want to say that, and then I have to go outside and work with my trees. But something to think about. Oh, one more thing. In terms of boundaries, we need to rethink relativity itself. Okay, we need to use, as Dennis Noble would say, biological relativity, but take it all the way to the point of the only measurement in space or time that's actually relevant is from the perspective of the first person subjective observer. And when you talk about boundaries, you need that observer that's interacting with the environment. That's the fundamental aspect of a Kantian whole, is the whole is interacting in an environment and it's feeding back down those constraints to the parts. But this is happening at every level. Every part is in its own whole. It's interacting with the environment. That's why the boundaries are so important, and the communication having some simple code across all levels. And that, I think, is bioelectricity that's rooted ultimately in resonance structures. So
meanwhile,
run.
you are at a miracle.
Okay.
If you see outside, this is the view out the window.
Oh, gorgeous.
And the issue is exactly which small branches are to be trimmed from the trees to change the view. This is not a minor issue. It's cosmic.
It's not only cosmic, but I've been after him to remove 2 branches for about 6 years now. And this is his birthday gift to me. So I'm going to go cash it in.
Married too, Stu. I know all about it.
It's a huge thing, you guys. I mean, the entire universe is trembling even at this very moment.
but anyway, I mean, Charlie, I'd actually like to have a conversation with you, like, where I could sort of clarify some things that I think that are quite coming across from a bunch of this literature. But we have three people here that are involved in this CBC research, and it's starting to come like this is at least one of the important cognitive glues, and one of the ways. And Richard Watson would agree with this. So if you have things that are operating on completely different scales with no overlap, they can't really come into resonance with each other. So CBC clocks seem to be certainly one of the ways in which we get this higher order cognitive glue. And we have three folks here who are working on precisely these problems. So let's hear a little bit from these guys on CBC theory.
So how do you guys feel that it answers this question, or are you guys following the controversy that we're having?
Not yet very well. Please explain it.
Okay. All right. Well, so it seems to me that self-interest does not scale. Self-interest is not a scalable sort of.
Well, when you say self-interest, though, Charlie,
I should speak really clearly. Like, the alternative I'm proposing is knowledge, right? That the smallest unit of life is the cell, and it's trying to create knowledge for itself. It's trying to understand the world around it. So it's trying to realize relevance, right? From the last paper we read. So it's trying to solve that problem, but it's solving that problem can scale and create knowledge for a larger entity. And that larger entity can also create knowledge for an even larger entity.
correct.
So that's like a well-known scaling process, right? Like, two heads are better than one. And so to me, if you see the like ultimate purpose, the problem that cells are trying to solve is not self-perpetuation or Kantian whole or anything like that. They're just trying to create local knowledge. And if you see that as the whole purpose for which they're, arranging the tools in their toolbox, and they're interpreting their genome, using it to accomplish a goal, which is to create knowledge. And so then that can easily scale all the way up to,
There's no argument with that, Charlie. Really,
at least as far as a holobiont, right? Which is totally unrelated organisms that are combining, like us in our microbiomes. We have to cooperate and speak the same language somehow. So I think these guys' paper partially solves that problem by pointing out that at least at the level of circadian rhythm, they're all operating with the same sort of oscillations, and presumably can
right. And that points to Richard Watson's, what Richard Watson was talking about with, you have sort of areas of overlap where you're looking at kind of the same frequencies and the same time scales, where you can sort of get this gluing process. This ties in with Friston and, and even with Chris Field's sort of, reformulation of quantum field theory in terms of communication across these interfaces. It's really all kind of in the same ballpark. But yeah, we'll certainly talk more about this, and I'd actually like to have a one-on-one conversation with you about some of this stuff too, because I think we're talking the same language. We're not really communicating, but I really do want to hear from these guys about CBC theory, while we're all here. Personally,
Can I raise a question, kind of preparatory, I'm really fascinated with the idea of creating knowledge. Let me translate that into the word, not propositional, but know-how. So we know how to tie our shoes.
correct, skills level.
All of life knows how to make a living, because all of life is non-equilibrium. We all have to eat to survive, right? So life has always had to find affordances in the world and figure out, recognize their relevance, to cognize, not recognize their relevance, and act appropriately. The co-evolving biosphere keeps creating novel affordances. It's niche creation, it's niche construction, it's the creation of new ways of making a living in the last 4 million years. I find myself echoing your thought, kind of amazed that the biosphere has in fact kept creating ever novel affordances that are seized by heritable variation and natural selection, or mind. Think of the evolution of the economy. So the kind of the noosphere of know-how keeps expanding. It's what you've said, and I've never thought of it that way.
Oh,
That
really?
They're seized before inheritance happens. They're learned, like they're seized before inheritance and variation. The source of variation is, in many respects, learning, and so that's sort of backwards, isn't it?
We might need to get to, right. So, you know, you see, I'll tell you two people who really, really dug into this stuff about a century ago. One of them is Alfred North Whitehead, and the other one is Charles Sanders Peirce, who some of you may or may not be familiar with. And they both really saw big parts of this. You know, so and this brings you to, there's all kinds of versions of panpsychism, but really, I think pan-experientialism, where, you know, at least at a basic level, there's some of this sort of kind of a combination of habit formation and learning memory at the most basic levels. But what happens in living systems is it really gets ramped up into something with much more capabilities. But you know, we're going to kind of end up digressing too far. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about any of this stuff. But let's see what these guys really are onto with this with the CBC theory. And we can have another discussion just about these topics or any one of them.
Yeah, well, I want to know, my first question about CBC clock theory is why you guys felt like it needed a different separate name from CBC theory. So do you think that the clock aspect of the argument is a profound enough difference that it couldn't just fit under the CBC theory? I found that really striking. Dr.
Let me start. I mean, Aurther and Bill can join, but I think František is the guy who, and Bill, I think they came up with this concept of the synome. And their book, I wasn't involved in that. The Sentient Cell, that's Aurther, Bill, and František, explains the nature of life as, you know, the entire life is sentient, from you know, single cell-like bacteria up to the multicellular organisms. And I guess through that process of sentience, and of course the consciousness is involved, but I think it's quite difficult to separate between the two. What's sentience, what's consciousness? But I guess somewhere there we have this knowledge creation and the capacity of these. I am a great supporter of Stuart Kauffmann's Kantian wholes, and I look at Kantian wholes as societies. So once you look at Kantian wholes as societies, then you get the entire biosphere. And I think for you, Charlie, I think what could help there is the concept of the holon that Arthur Kessler invented. He was saying that, you know, nothing in life is part, nothing is the whole, is the holon. Holon is the part and the whole at the same time. So I guess the acts of sentience, the acts of consciousness, this is what makes it's part of life. But this is what makes the resonance of life, of living organisms. I guess we are constrained by kind of abstract terminology here, but I like what Stuart Kauffmann explained. I mean, you know, we as scientists would like to find, you know, the examples of causality, the you know, constrained closures, etc. Once you include all of this, things become extremely complicated. And I mean, I think Stuart mentioned Robert Rosen. Robert Rosen tried to kind of define what complexity means from the perspective of life. And he came up with, I think, the answer that the organism and the machine are different things and perhaps operate using different kinds of logic. So I guess sentience is something that's very difficult to sort of, I'm not sure how to explain sentience to physicists and whether, you know, you can talk about sentience, say, in the context of black holes or something like that, you know. And Robert Rosen was very radical. He was saying that, if I'm correct, I'm not sure whether I'm interpreting him. He was saying that physics is the particular and biology is the general, based on his you know, mathematical modeling, etc. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, maybe Arthur and Bill can join, that what defines life and makes life different from the non-living organisms, non-living systems, is this emergence of sentience and consciousness, and we can't see that sentience and consciousness exists in the machines. Maybe that's too controversial for some of you.
Well, as someone who, probably the only one here who actually wrote a dictionary, I wrote the Dictionary of Psychology, went through 4 editions. It'll never go through a 5th because the internet killed it. Nobody has to buy a dictionary anymore. They just go online and find out what a term means. But having done that and having struggled with definitions, I have concluded that discussions about sentience and consciousness should be dealt with from a lay person's perspective. These are terms to be used in the way in which they're discussed on ordinary platforms by ordinary people. And here's the reason. Antonio Damasio, Catherine, talk about feelings and emotions. He's Spinoza's champion. I've known Antonio for many, many years. And we invited him to write a chapter for a book that we edited recently called The Cognitive Unconscious, the First Half Century. And he did. And he tossed in smack at the CBC theory because we're old friends and he gets to do this to me. And what he said was, okay, look, I understand all these things that prokaryotes do. I understand all these things that cells do, but that's not consciousness. But it is. And what he has done by that is make it into a terminological argument, a lexicographic argument. These terms should be used in layperson's forms. We know what they mean. They mean sentience, awareness, consciousness, internal representations. It's an inherent feature of all living forms. There would be a living form that is not sentient. They're coterminous. They come with life and they go away with death. And so, Roderick, if it's okay with you, I don't want to define these terms. By the way, in both the first Minds, which is where the CBC was first put out in the book form, and in the Sentient Cell, we had an appendix. And in our next book, I'm going to recommend strongly that we do it again. And this is to try to deflect these arguments away from lexicography and focus on the science.
Why? I have a question about that. Why do you guys suppose that anesthesia doesn't cause cancer, or unconsciousness doesn't cause cancer?
I have not thought of that. But if now that I've given it 7.5 seconds of deep pondering, I'm going to go back to my earlier notion, my reductionist position, that that this cancer is not the result of an identity problem, but it's a result of a biomolecular problem. Maybe perhaps something in the cell membrane that is what's producing the underlying identity crisis. See, I guess I'm kind of a reductionist. No, I'm not kind of. I am a reductionist. I want to take these things right down to the basic molecular foundations. And I think the basic molecular foundations are what produces the awareness, produces the cognition, produces the consciousness, the sentience. And I want to, it's Addie Pross put it nicely. I thought he said, what we got to do is to figure out how chemistry made biology.
I would like to go back to your, Arthur, you have an excellent capacity to ask right questions. So you asked about what's cancer. I think that's, the answer, very simple answer to that. Cancer is not one disease. It's about 100 different diseases. Every cell type has its own identity. So every cell identity leads to a different form of cancer. Now, there was a discussion about metastasis earlier. And again, as cancer researchers, most of us interpret everything through the human models. Metastasis simply is the escape of cells from tissues, from the prison of the tissue. And the human tissues are not good at keeping cells in prison. But some other models, like naked mole rats, this was discovered a few years ago, they actually have different proteins that are longer. Those proteins surrounding cells, they actually keep cells immovable in the kind of prison of the body, and there are no metastases there. So I guess a cancer research could benefit from including different models, not only mouse, humans, etc., but naked mole rat. This is, a known organism. If you look at the elephants have 3 copies of a tumor suppressor gene called P53, which exists only in 2 copies in our bodies, and elephants are more resistant to cancer than humans. So I think cancer is a hugely complex thing, and we try to answer it through very simplistic means. Sometimes we make a success, but sometimes not. More.
I have to go to the doctor. Would want me to come down today.
Yeah, I hear some.
I'm going to start taking care of the stuff on the mortgage too.
Hey Wayne, I think your video is unmuted. I think.
Can I ask a question about CBC? One rhythm is circadian. Cells have all kinds of rotating behaviors. The cell cycle is a cycle. It might be a cycle of genes turning one another on and off in a cyclic pattern. There's evidence for biochemical oscillations in the cell cycle, or coupled oscillations and gatekeeping steps and so on. Circadian rhythms. But do you know the name Art Winfrey, who first showed that the circadian rhythm is a limit cycle oscillator with singularities? Just fascinating stuff. But the question, it's obvious that if you have a rhythm, Arthur, that can be used to expect something that will come up at 2 o'clock. Why should we call upon sentience in the sense of awareness? Mind you, I'm happy to do so, but let me try to pose it this way. What I've been trying to do with my friend Andrea Roli is to find things that a computer cannot do and say, well, if we can do it and a computer cannot, then we're not computers, if we can find examples of it. So I too am persuaded that we're all aware, and I think bacteria are aware. It'd be nice to find third-person data that forces us to use the word sentience, meaning awareness. So what forces us to? And the counterexample is Jacques Monod, who's a really smart guy, who would take the contrary argument and say, as if. So we're really seeking clarity. These are major issues. I want for the moment to hang on to third-person data, because we all have the first person. What forces us to something like sentience with respect to say, circadian rhythms. I don't mean this as an assault.
Your question about what computers can't do?
No, sure. I mean,
Well,
if you want to get out the door. So no, look, I guess what I'm asking is the following. What third-person evidence do we have that forces us to say that a bacterial cell with a circadian rhythm that does things in a timely way has any sentient experiences at all?
well, all right, let's just take what I think is a pretty simple example, but it's a very elegant study. You feed a colony of actually, you can do it with an individual bacteria, but it's really tiny. You feed a colony lactose, and then you follow it up with maltose, and then you give them lactose again, and maltose, lactose, maltose, lactose, maltose. Then you give them maltose, and they don't take it up very smoothly. They're inefficient because they've already made the gene expression adjustments in anticipation of lactose, because they learned an alternating pattern. Now, if that's not evidence of sentience, I don't know what the hell is.
But why does one? You can make a machine with back propagation, in a computer that can learn rhythms from the outside world that are being pumped in a robot. And I don't feel that anything forces you to sentience out of that. It's
because the robot doesn't make mistakes. Because the robot doesn't accidentally knock over a glass of wine. The robot responds on the basis of the hardware that is and the software.
The robot won't change its model.
Into it.
But that's exactly our issue, right? Of course, and we all think the robot's not sentient at all. Yet it can have, and it could even make mistakes. You would have noise in the system. The question is, what we will all buy our own first-person experiences. For the moment, what we're asking is, what third-person data forces us to ascribe experience to the bacterium?
Can I give
Very
No, I'm just not trying to be. All I'm trying to do is say, by what criteria would we say blah?
What do we mean by experience? So that sometimes gets to be a big problem. People hear sentience, they think like human sentience. It could just mean mutual vulnerability at the very basal level. It's kind of, mutual susceptibility. So there's an area in which there can be communication and memory. I think that's kind of what we mean by basal sentience or basal.
Can I just give an example of this very trivial, perhaps third-person experience? Is very similar to Aurther's example, but it was provided in a different context. So there is an organism, it's not a bacterium, it's an amoeba. It's called, the French call it the blob, very famous. So it's a single cell organism that can grow, simply divides the nucleus, but it remains in the same cytoplasm. So the French lady who investigated this organism exchanged it with their, I think, American and Australian colleagues. So you can easily grow this thing in the lab. You simply put it in a petri dish and then you feed it with pieces of muesli. And they're happy to grow and expand. But I mean, this question about the third person experience is quite important. So the lady reports when they take an American blob and feed it the Australian muesli, it doesn't like it at all. But it does like the American muesli. So it takes some time to get used to one or the other. So I guess this is, in a sense, who's the third person here? We are basically as researchers. So researchers, we know how to feed this organism in our lab in our very limited conditions. So in a sense, we communicate two ways with this organism. When we get the same organism from a different geographical location, we lose the communication with it, and then this organism will communicate perhaps with the other one in terms of which food it selects to eat. And obviously, after a certain amount of time, they can even eat salt, but it takes time for them to get used to it. So the flexibility of the living systems is that they can basically adapt to anything. But then I think we as interpreters sometimes simplify things or oversimplify things. And I guess this is my example of this third person experience.
Perry?
So I'd like to take a crack at Stu's question. I think what you're looking for is, what is a rigorous way that you could determine that an organism is making an inference and not merely doing a computation? Is that a way, or taking advantage of an affordance as opposed to just running an algorithm? Open-ended evolution, is that fair?
Yeah, Perry, I think so. My try with Aurther Reber is to notice that the different uses of an object cannot be deduced from one another.
Right.
You know, my beloved example of the engine block can be used as a paperweight, but it has rigid corners and it can be used to crack open coconuts by prying them. But you cannot deduce one from the other. Now, we can make that deduction all the time. It's called jury rigging. And, you know, you and I have talked about this. Human beings jury rig, and we can do multi-step jury rigging. I guess maybe Wynn or somebody quoted I quoted the one from whatever it was, the spaceship that did the multi-step jury rigging on the something or another. We can do it. A computer can't. A non-embodied, and this is Andrea's argument, let me just make it. Aurther Reber's argument, he's a roboticist. A computer has a set of objects and a set of procedures, and it can ring all the changes on all the objects and all the procedures in its ontology, which is syntactic. And it can do all the possible combinations of all of the syntactic, which is the same as formal.
Mm-hmm.
It can't get out of them. And the reason is it can't ground symbols. And so we tried to argue, and I think we're right, the computer cannot, the unembodied universal Turing machine cannot jury rig. So then we started thinking, because Andrea does robotics, well, what about a robot? And so, because a robot can interact with the world, and Andrea's example is, if you're a robot and you can kick things, you can discover that when you kick an engine block, it rotates. So we came up with, okay, so see what you think of our argument. So the task that the robot has is it's got an engine block that it's using it right now as a paperweight, and it really wants to crack open a coconut. And the solution is to rotate the engine block in a certain way and tilt it in a certain way and use the robot arm to reach over and pick up a coconut and bang it against the corner of the engine block and crack it up without ruining it. So now think of actually doing that. So this is our example. So you could rotate the engine block 14 degrees clockwise, and then tilt it 17 degrees on its edge, and then proceed. But you could have rotated it a different number of angles and tipped it a different number of ways. And then we got thinking about the fact, suppose that the robot knows that it can rotate the engine block clockwise. How can it get from that move is part of a set of coordinated moves that will solve the problem? Because the successive steps cannot be deduced from one another, there's no local clue in a multi-step combinatorial in a multi-step jury rigging. There's no local clue that you're on the path of the solution. So what we realized is that when we do that, and humans do it all the time, there's no local cue that you're getting better. So how do we do it? And we concluded that a universal Turing machine that's not embodied can't, and a An embodied universal Turing machine could do it, but to do it, it has to interact with the actual object, because you can't deduce what will happen when we fiddle with the object. And those operations take time. And so we kind of waved our hand and said, if you've got to do 16 of these steps and each one takes a century, you'll rust. Namely, a classical system can't do it fast enough, and we do it, bam. You know, they did it on the flight. So we hope that this is at least one example of something that's third person that we can do, that a universal Turing machine that's not embodied can't. And we hope that a robot can't either. So if we buy that argument, Perry, that's one example, if we accept it, of something we can do that a Turing machine can't. And therefore, by the way, our doing that, or an organism evolving to do it, is outside of whatever it is, the universal computational framework. I've forgotten the famous name. Church Turing. Evolution is something beyond Church Turing. And so are we when we jury rig.
Right. You know, one thing I think that you may, maybe let someone else, but one thing you need what we talked about last week in terms of what affordances actually are and relevance realization to get to this.
That's absolutely central.
Yeah. I'd like to offer a strictly cell-based answer to the question, what evidence can we offer that cells are sentient? And when you ask for a third person, let's keep in mind that none of us know that the other person is really self-aware. We assume it. We know that we know. We assume that you know. And we assume that you know in a self-similar manner. And I'll make the point that bacteria do the same. They all have basal cognition. And I've defined that, starting in 2016, as a suite, I'm going to read it actually, a suite of self-referential cellular competencies possessed by all cells that permit the measured assessment of ambiguous information and its further communication and deployment to enable individual and collective problem solving. If we take that as a suite of competencies, then we have explicit third-person proof that all cells are competent. They all engage, they collaborate, cooperate, they establish codependencies, they freely trade resources, they compete, but unlike humans, in a generalized mutual fashion, generally mutualizing, like co-engineering teams will fight with each other to get ahead of the other just for bragging rights or whatever. Generally, competition at the cellular level is mutualizing, except for cancer as a separate self. And cells respect self-integrity. We know that as an absolute fact. We can just examine all biofilms, we can examine ourselves, and we know that those suite of competencies exist. Now the question is, in the definition, that's the measured assessment of ambiguous information. Why is that important? Because when you look at the individual cell as a Kantian whole, sorry, Charlie, but I'm going to disagree if you don't mind as our host.
Oh, no, I think that's very productive. Thank you.
Why will I defend Stu's idea of a Kantian whole? Because two things are necessary to establish a Kantian whole at the cellular level. Need a competent discriminating boundary. Cells have that in external plasma membrane. And you need that linked to retrievable and deployable memory. And cells have that. Those are both provable things. So they achieve constrained closure because of those two peculiar properties which define the cognitive system of our planet. Absolutely. We are all cell-based. There's no organism on this planet that is not cell-based. Even viruses, which may or may not be alive, we could debate that forever, really are only active within the living cell. So the cognitive cell is the very basis of life. It's the cellular basis of consciousness. Now, I'll finish the measured assessment of ambiguous information. What is ambiguous information? All biological information is ambiguous. Why? Just think of a cell. A cell is sitting with its companions or even alone, and any environmental cue it's going to experience has to travel across media, takes time from the cue, a flash of light, whatever it is that the cell is going to respond to, a vibration, anything. Time delays, crossing of media, it has to, that environmental cue does not exist for that cell until it reaches the external biofields and crosses the external membrane where there's noise. So there's no such thing as perfect information for a cell, which is completely unlike computers because they have no concept of uncertain information. All the information is a square wave to them, whereas for every cell, think of it as an analog waveform. It's all noisy. Because the information is imperfect, the cell has to measure it internally. And when it does so, it gets two things from it. One is value like amplitude. It's that strong a signal. But the cell is going to use that ambiguous information. It's going to make a measurement of that. It's going to make a discriminatory decision of its value to support a preferential state of preference, of homeoretic flux. Cells are non-equilibrium, homeoretic flux organisms. And so it is sentient because the information is being used to support its preferential state. And why do I assert that they're preferential states? Well, I'm a physician. And I can tell you from my experience that infectious disease is a perfect example of cells expressing preferential states. The same bacterial species will not go absolutely to the same site all the time, but very likely it has states of preference that it meets. Why does Haemophilus influenza go to the lung? Almost always, but not 100%. Why do amoeba only go to the brain, the liver, and the retina? It's because these are preferential habitats for these organisms. That's preference, that's sentience. There's a lot of third-person data that should convince us that all cells are sense-aware, competent, and sentient.
I'm finding this lovely and need to go, but I wonder if I could take a moment to tell you, if you don't know this, something. Do you guys know the Conway-Cochin free will theorem?
No.
So we're wondering where sentience comes from. So if you want to, it's Conway, John Conway, and Conway, and Simon Cochin, Kochen. It's called the strong free will theorem. It was proved about 4 or 5 or 6 years ago. So in quantum mechanics, an electron can, upon measurement, become up, or it can become down. It was neither prior to the actualization event. And what they prove is the following. So I have an entangled pair of electrons, and for either one of them, it is true that, quotes, one, nothing in the past of the universe determines whether the electron will become up or down. There is no cause of measurement, which was shocking to the physicists, and these guys are physicists. And the third thing, this is just amazing. The electron decides if it will become up or down. And they are ascribing free will to the electron. And read the article. They in a sense, are assuming free will on the part of the experimenters, but I don't think they have to. Now, by that for the moment, the electron really free will decides, okay, I think I'll become up, or I think I'll become down. Just accept their conclusion. Now I'm going to tell you something that's standard quantum mechanics. I take a million electrons, and however the physicists prepare electrons, I prepare the set of identical electrons so that upon measurement, they're 60% probable of becoming up and 40% of becoming down. And you do the experiment, and you've got 1 trillion electrons, and you do it, and almost exactly 60% become up and 40% become down. And the electrons are independent of one another. They're not entangled. So just take those two premises. So Conway and Cochin are right. Each electron's got free will. And it says, so all right, I'll become up. I decide to become up, or I decide to come down. It's free will. And I've got 1 billion electrons. They're independent of one another. Whatever it means to prepare them, they're prepared such that take their amplitudes and square them at 60% up and 60% down. Why is it true, if they all have independent free will, that 60% of them do become up and 40% do become down? And I am almost forced to preference. Now, this is getting really weird, right? Because if you say that, at least free will and preference choice is present in electrons. And it's only one step to say, for me, when the wave function is collapsed, there's a burst of consciousness, qualia, and Roger Penrose has a rather similar theory. So maybe our quest for consciousness goes all the way back to fundamental particles. Not that I know that that's true, you guys, but the free will theorem has stood the test of time, I think. And the others are just a standard quantum mechanical claim. And maybe it means something. I don't know.
I read the paper you're talking about, Stu, back actually when I read your book. What they actually proved, so the hypothesis was that, if the experimenter can actually set up this experiment, so that all the possible experiments you can set up, you can set up this particular experiment that biases the probabilities in this way, then an electron have free will. And that's QED. I mean,
yeah,
no argument to it.
Yeah. So listen, I just am so glad that you guys have invited me to join you all. I've read the material that Kate sent me, and I only got to it today because I'm busy doing other stuff and we're all busy. I'm just finding this an amazing conversation, and I want to thank everybody for letting me join. I don't know whether to go protect the limbs or not before Kate gets them.
Always great to have you, Stu.
Yeah,
Thank you, Stuart.
Yeah, I'm really glad to be parting in this and discussing with you guys. Thanks so much.
Wonderful.
And let's hope that we get Trump out.
Yeah, it looks much more promising.
Don't you think?
It does, yeah.
Did you hear Wallace's line about it? I'm looking forward to debating debating Vance if he can get off the couch.
Yeah.
It's good to hammer back at the Republic. They're not used to being hit back at. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Oh, maybe, wait a second. Do you have time for a 1.5 minute joke? Because we were talking about caterpillars, right?
Absolutely.
So this is a really sweet joke. It's for 4-year-olds. So this man wants to buy a pet, and he doesn't want a cat or a dog. So he goes to the pet store, and the pet store owner says, look, why don't you buy a talking centipede? That's okay. And he buys a talking centipede, and he brings it home, and he makes a little nest for it. And he comes down the next morning and says, good morning, centipede. And the centipede doesn't say anything. The morning after he comes down, he says, hi, centipede, do you want to go for a walk? And the centipede doesn't say anything. So the third day he comes down and says, good morning, centipede, would you like to walk to church? And the centipede said, I heard you yesterday. I'm still putting on my shoes. I just love it. Thanks, guys.
Great. Yeah, well, I really appreciate y'all coming, and this was really fascinating. I think we've definitely opened up a lot of questions that we haven't resolved, but some of the ways that I think this conversation sort of branches are, for me, there's a question of predictive processing, whether organisms are using this cell membrane as a sort of Markov blanket, like you guys argued in the paper. That to me is a really interesting claim, and something we might have a chance to get into later. That's kind of a recurrent theme in these conversations, it seems. Some of us got to know each other through Richard Watson's seminar. Wayne and I did, at least. I don't know if you guys know Richard Watson or the stuff that he's been doing. He's writing a book right now with Mike Levin at Tufts. So Richard Watson's at University of Southampton. And it's possible that next time we meet, that this group, loose group here meets, it may be around Richard's, some of Richard's work and his videos they're called Songs of Life and Mind. And he talks about a question that I'm, very interested in, the question of a sort of universal language. And I think it's very congruent with the idea of CBC Clock Theory. He thinks of it in terms of harmonic resonance, and so I think we'll probably drift in that direction, talking about mechanism. I still think that there's this controversy that we got into about Kantian holes that I seem to be the only person.
Well, you know what?
I think we can leave that aside, because so many intuitions that are sort of above the level of that seem to match up. And so I don't think we need to get deep into that again next time. But there is also, like, this, for me, this question of the circadian rhythm as a sort of oscillation, and sort of what role it's playing in cementing as the cognitive glue.
Well, one thing you can see, Charlie, sorry to interrupt, is that, so if we're talking about anticipatory systems, and if you want to talk about anticipatory systems even pre-life, periodic behavior sort of gives you a very easy basis for kind of the beginnings of anticipatory systems, because there's something that, that periodicity gives you something that's repeatable, that you can count on in terms of anticipation, right? I think that's kind of, so if you want to get from non-life to life, where life may perhaps ratchet all these things up and make use of whatever is available in new and novel ways, because that's what life does. That's a long conversation. But where did this even come from? I think periodicity is actually a great place to look.
Yeah, I mean, there's this other connection, as far as like high level agreement, I think, between many of us. There's this other connection with harmonic resonance and Gestalt theory.
Honey,
I'm
gonna get something not so stinky.
Let me unmute you for a second, Wayne. Sorry. There's this other question of Gestalt theory. So there's this really interesting guy who I'm hoping to get into this group. I've been meeting with him lately. His name is Stephen Lehar. So he did a lot of work on optical illusions, and basically formalized a way to sort of recapitulate Gestalt perception in terms of standing waves. And I think that, sort of for me, that bridges this whole thing together, and sort of seeing cognition as the creation of standing waves inside of an organism. But anyway, that's just maybe a sneak peek. And
I'm just, if I may, I would just want to reinforce. So I think Wayne made a really important point, and I think that it should be clarified that the point of the clock theory was to provide a mechanism, a reasonable thought experiment mechanism to defend the cellular basis of consciousness. And the idea was a circadian rhythm, which is not exact, involves anticipation. And so that is can be deemed a sentient behavior beyond pure computation, that there's something else to it. Important to the theory, to the clock theory, is that the clock is emanating from essential bioelectrical fields that are crucial to consciousness. That's part of the sonomic mechanism that has been brought up. And these link to electron transfers and redox homeostasis mechanisms. And so the point of this was to try to offer a purported means, Charlie, and I think you've been pointing to this also, where sentience could come from, beyond simply stating flatly that it exists. And so just as I offered an explanation based on ambiguous information, this is another line of evidence that Pedrag and Aurther have offered to defend the primary stance that cognition and life are coterminous. And I think this is the single most important thing for us. Nobody understands how cognition began, consciousness, but we do all agree that our team that is working together and putting papers together and hopefully a book, that the rational basis of biology is to build from that conscious base, that cognitive base. And then we can understand a lot of things that don't make sense, like why cells differentiate as they do and so on, by working from the cognitive base, cognitive selection, a new concept, that instead of natural selection, you have cognitive selection.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
If you start with cognition at the base, then all selection is cognitive discrimination.
Right.
And then you have a biological system that is problem solving, communication and problem solving, and that's natural learning. And so that's the progression of our thoughts. The circadian clock is to try to provide an academically rigorous way of kind of a quasi third person statement on why sentience exists within the cell.
You know, and an awful lot of things we talk about first person and third person. I have to leave in a minute, so let me just say this real quickly. Especially from a cognitive science point of view, John Vervaeke's actually doing a lot of work on this. I mean, it all goes way back to Plotinus. But from an empirical point of view, Mike Levin's lab is doing an awful lot that shows that a lot of what's important is second person. It isn't even third person. It isn't third person, or of course, first person is important. But a lot of what goes on in biology has to do with local perspectives hacking each other. In other words, understanding what knobs to tweak to get that system to use its competencies to do what you need it to do.
The name of that thing is symbiosis, living together.
Well, yeah, but it goes much deeper than just, of course, that they call it synthbiosis.
No, if you're talking about the second person, that's, first, second person, that's...
Sure, of course, that's the basic of it, but right, so, you go back to Lynn Margulis or even further back, Likens.
No, even you're more familiar with mathematicians like Freeman Dyson.
Sure.
He had, his... universal symbiogenesis that's prior to Lynn Margulis. It's applicable to the universe, to galaxies, things like that.
Yeah, and I'm kind of a buyer, as a matter of fact, at least in some sense, as far as that goes. I'm also a mathematician. I mean,
oh yeah, that's good. That's good.
I'm gonna have to go, but I want to close on a different note. And Thomas Kuhn's famous book on revolutions in science said that they usually come about because young scholars whose brains haven't been calcified, haven't been in the system, they're the ones that make the changes. I'm looking at this group here, and I'm looking at my co-authors in our papers and books. We're not exactly spring chickens here. So how come a bunch of geezers are making the fundamental breakthroughs and introducing novel ways to represent the foundations of evolutionary biology?
I might argue that.
And you know what the answer is, I think, Wayne? Is that none of us were trained in the standard model.
That's part of it. I actually was. I just called bullshit on it. I started grad school as in an integrated biosciences program in cell and developmental biology, I mean, I did biochemistry and biophysics and genetics and all that kind of stuff. It just it was incorrect. I was sure it was incorrect.
So you were way ahead of all of us.
One thing I would argue maybe, and I really do have to go, is that the reason you see geezers doing this is because, you know, in a lot of cases, what Thomas Kuhn was talking about was kind of more reductionist paradigm type of science, even though there were some breakthroughs. But the types of questions we're wrestling with on questions of life and mind are questions that require decades of wrestling with before you actually have a chance to come to these conceptions or to even really come to formulate the questions.
Well, a simple observation here, just my experience, and František and Bill, I believe, have had similar experiences, is giving talks on this to various groups. And when I give talks to groups of intelligent lay people, like at an elder college or the Fulbright Foundation, I was a Fulbright professor, and so I go to some of these meetings. What I find is when people who are not trained in biology, they listen and they go, oh, I hadn't thought about that, but that makes sense. Now give the same talk to a bunch of cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists, and you get, well, now I think that's a little bridge too far. Now give the same talk to a bunch of philosophers, especially philosophers of mind, and I have some background in that field, and they think you've lost yours. So this is kind of amusing.
Because once you engage in a paradigm for a long time, you're sort of immersed in the community. There's certain constraints that are caused by the dominant paradigm, and there's also the effect, there's social effects where you don't want to be an outcast and you don't want to be doubted, and there's economic pressure to publish and to fit in your department. You know, so all these things. Now, the fact that that some of us, like me, I'm not a professional academic. You know, that actually, you know, that sort of intellectual freedom maybe does have a lot to do with why us geezers actually are seeing things this way.
Well, I can say that our son is a well-known, prominent, even neuroscientist at Northwestern, Bill's old university, and he thinks I'm nuts. He just doesn't buy it, and he's, you know, but his thing is he does human neuroscience. He's looking at the human brain and human consciousness and human cognitive function, and he can't get away from that platform.
There's also a lot of baggage of terminology. You know, so for instance, even when you guys use the word sentience, what you mean by sentience is really something like basal cognition. When most people discuss like a distinction between consciousness and sentience and cognition, what they generally mean by sentience is something much closer to something that you don't really see in higher animals, where you know, they even if they have an autobiographical narrative, or they you know, they can really feel pain in a way that, you know, perhaps a microorganism doesn't have quite the same experience of pain.
That's an important point, Wayne. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to bail out on this, and see you all next time. Okay.
See you all next time. That was it. It's really helpful.
I'll turn it off as soon as I figure out how to do that.
Okay. All right.
Oh, there it is.
We'll call it then. And thank you guys so much again for your participation.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for including me.
Thanks, everyone, and nice meeting you.
Wonderful. Bye-bye.